A report in Brazilian media says that Trump advisor and deadbeat dad Jason Miller was detained in Brazil this morning by federal police before boarding a private jet back to the United States as part of an investigation into anti-democratic acts. Now, what does that mean? Well, in a statement, Miller said that he and other members of his traveling party were questioned for 3 hours at the airport in Brazil after having attended this week's CPAC Brazil conference before eventually being released to fly back to the United States. Miller also tried to downplay what happened. He said, "We were not accused of any wrongdoing and told only that they wanted to talk. We informed them that we had nothing to say and were eventually released to fly back to the United States. Our goal of sharing free speech around the world continues." Now, Miller is the founder, CEO of Uygur, right-wing social media platform. He claims to be, some warrior for free speech, but as we know, conservatives usually have no interest in free speech, especially when it comes to speech that they personally dislike. But this story about him being detained and questioned is a perfect opportunity to talk about what's happening in Brazil under the leadership of Jair Bolsonaro, who's in a lot of hot water right now. His approval rating, not great. Lula da Silva, who hasn't officially announced that he's going to run in the next election, is already leading him in the polls by quite a bit. And the handling of the coronavirus pandemic by Jair Bolsonaro has been a complete and utter disaster. The economy has been flailing in the country. And that's after Lula da Silva, by the way, lifted 20 million people out of poverty under his leadership. So as you can imagine, Bolsonaro is terrified about losing the upcoming election. It'll take place in about 13 months. And he's looking for ways to stay in power because he's also concerned that should he fail to get reelected, he's gonna face prosecution. And again, it sounds very similar to what we experienced with Donald Trump. So let's talk about that a little bit. Sources tell the Washington Post that the questioning of Miller was ordered by a Supreme Court justice in Brazil. But at the same time, the reason the Supreme Court justices are kind of on guard is because Bolsonaro has consistently threatened to fire, like do away with the Supreme Court justices, essentially paving the way to maintain his power in the country, even if he lacks the popularity to be able to do so. Bolsonaro has described the investigation, several of which are targeting his own family members, as an unfair infringement of his national authority as president. He has accused the Supreme Court of exceeding its constitutional power, and last month submitted a request to impeach the Supreme Court justice who ordered the detention of Miller. The Senate quickly tossed it out as baseless. So again, he's in hot water over his handling of COVID, over the economy, and let's keep it real, Bolsonaro, who openly fantasizes about the military coup, the military dictatorship in Brazil that no longer exists. He wants it back. Also used the courts to turn his political opponent into a political prisoner, essentially conducting a soft coup. So for him to say, "Oh, these Supreme Court justices, they're going too far. These are infringements on my rights." It's rich. It's rich to hear that from him. And it's especially rich when he is already claiming that there's widespread voter fraud, the same thing that we experienced with Donald Trump in the lead up to the 2020 general election. He is essentially threatening to dismantle the Constitution of Brazil. In fact, why don't we go to this report from France 24, which gives us more details about what Bolsonaro has been up to.
Openly nostalgic of Brazil's military dictatorship, President Bolsonaro has also of late reminded the country of his ties to the military, hosting an unprecedented procession of tanks on August 10th. A flexing of military might, a show of his avid fan base, Bolsonaro has launched an offensive. For polls show that 60% of voters would under no circumstances vote for him again in next year's elections. And his presidency has been hit hard by a raft of judicial investigations, including Supreme Court probes. ones that the far-right leader shot back against last week, calling for his supporters to rally and to issue what he calls an ultimatum to the Supreme Court.
After September the 7th, those one or two who dare to defy the Constitution, disrespect the Brazilian people, they will know how to return to their place.
Bolsonaro's critics say they're fearful that the president is encouraging an attack on the courts, in the vein of Trump fans charging the U.S. Capitol. In an open letter, some 150 left-leaning international political figures said that they were gravely concerned about the imminent threat to Brazil's democratic institutions. A likely challenger in next year's elections, former President Lula da Silva, also commented on social media, saying Bolsonaro was sowing hatred, division, and violence rather than providing solutions.
Now, the individuals who signed that letter indicating that they're concerned about the dismantling of the democratic system in Brazil certainly have cause for worry. I mean, they've had a cause for worry, because had Lula da Silva been allowed to run in the election, had he not been imprisoned as a political prisoner, it's very likely that he would have won the election in 2018. But Jair Bolsonaro conspired with a judge by the name of Sergio Moro to ensure that Lula da Silva would be imprisoned. He saw what the polls said. Lula da Silva was definitely leading in the polls by quite a bit, and Bolsonaro decided, well, let's throw him in prison. Let's make him part of this Lava Jato investigation into corruption. By the way, all of those convictions have been overturned by the courts in Brazil this year. So it was very clearly a political effort to imprison Bolsonaro's political opponent. And so Bolsonaro said last month, he only sees 3 possible futures for himself. And I think that this is telling. Imprisonment, death, or victory. He has repeatedly flirted with the idea of a constitutional rapture without specifying what that would be. And much like Donald Trump inciting the riots that took place in the Capitol on January 6th, if you go to Brazil, there's a very similar type of push by Bolsonaro, encouraging individuals to break through police barriers in the Capitol. In fact, the violence toward journalists is pretty clear in videos that are posted all over the internet. In fact, I'll show you one of them right now. Look, the United States, unfortunately, is exporting some of the worst elements of our political discourse. And it's happening with organizations like CPAC holding conferences in Brazil. Why? You think conservatives in America care about what's going down in Brazil? I mean, they do if it threatens their business interests. And so preventing the election of Lula da Silva is incredibly important to them. They don't want leftists leading in countries like Brazil. By the way, Lula da Silva did incredible things for the economy in Brazil. Not only did he improve the economy, he lifted 20 million people out of poverty in the country. But that comes at a cost for international business interests. So that's why you have CPAC holding a conference there. That's why you have clowns like Jason Miller showing up. That's why you have this cycle of disinformation regarding the election and how there's allegedly fraud. Why do you think Bolsonaro is talking about election fraud? It's the same reason why Trump was talking about election fraud. He can see the polls, he can see what's going down, he can see that Lula da Silva is leading in the polls as we speak. So the first thing that people with dictatorial tendencies will do is make the people of whatever country they're leading question the institutions, question the electoral system, and if the results turn out to be something you dislike, something you don't agree with, well then don't accept them. That's exactly what's going down in Brazil right now. And again, Bolsonaro is just taking a page out of Donald Trump's book on how to attempt to steal an election. He's getting his ducks in a row and he's got all the American-based right-wingers helping him out. It's pretty disgusting, but just know what's happening. This isn't just about the United States. It's about the type of authoritarian nonsense, undemocratic behavior that we're exporting out of our country into places like Brazil.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.